What if I told you a 5-mile strip of sand off Iran's coast was worth more to that regime than every tank in its army? That's not a guess. That's Kharg Island, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it became the single most dangerous piece of geography in this entire war. I'm Ryan. I flew F-15Es in combat, flew F-16S with the Thunderbirds, and I fly airliners now. And my whole job here is separating what actually happened from whatever headline is trending today. So let's get into it properly, source by source, because this one deserves it. Here's the number that makes everything else in this story make sense: 90%. That's how much of Iran's total oil exports move through Kharg Island, a piece of land smaller than a third of Manhattan, sitting there with jetties deep enough to load full-size supertankers, wired by pipelines straight into Iran's biggest offshore fields. American intelligence has known this for decades, not months. There's a declassified CIA document from 1984 that flat out called this facility the most vital node in Iran's entire oil system, warning that its survival was essential to the regime's economic survival. Full stop. So when I tell you this island has been sitting in the crosshairs of American strategic planning since before I was born, I'm not exaggerating for effect. And here's a detail that genuinely stopped me when I found it. Back in 1988, decades before he ever ran for president, Donald Trump told The Guardian that if one bullet was ever fired at an American ship, he'd go take Kharg Island himself. That's not a talking point somebody wrote for him this year. That's something that's apparently been sitting in his head since the Reagan administration. Keep that in your back pocket, because it explains a lot about what comes next. On March 13th, Trump announced the American military had, in his words, totally obliterated military forces on the island, calling it one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. 90-plus targets, naval mine storage, missile bunkers, air defenses, a naval base, a helicopter hangar. And here's the detail that gets buried under all that dramatic language, and it's the single most important fact in this entire story. He did not touch the oil terminal. He said it himself, publicly, that he was sparing it for reasons of decency. Even Iran's own state media confirmed it. No casualties among oil workers, no interruption to loading operations. The tankers kept moving. So right there on day one, you already have the split that defines everything that follows. Military side, hammered. Economic engine, deliberately spared. But Trump didn't just stop at obliterated. He pivoted straight to a threat, warning he'd immediately reconsider sparing the oil infrastructure if Iran kept closing the Strait of Hormuz. Iran fired back just as hard, warning that any American-linked energy infrastructure would be turned to ash. Both sides threatening the other's economic lifeline while very carefully avoiding actually pulling that trigger. That's the tension that's going to run through this entire story, so hold on to it. There's also a messy diplomatic subplot worth flagging, honestly. Iran's Fars news agency claimed the strike launched from HIMARS systems fired out of the UAE, and Iran threatened retaliation against Emirati ports over it. The UAE denied it flat out. I want to be straight with you. That origin claim is disputed, not settled, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because it makes a better story. A week later, Axios reported Trump was actually weighing blockading or occupying the island outright, and a White House official told the BBC the military could take out Kharg at any time, adding Trump retains all options as commander-in-chief. So even a week in, this was never a closed chapter. Then early April happened, and this is where the story stops being a one-off and becomes a pattern. The U.S. struck Kharg again, hitting roughly 50 of the same target sets from March. Vice President Vance said it publicly. This wasn't a change in strategy, just leverage being applied on a deadline, an 8 p.m. Eastern cutoff for Iran to reopen the strait. And once again, critically, the oil infrastructure walked away untouched. Iran's own Mehr news agency said the maritime export machinery suffered little damage and kept operating like nothing happened. 2 separate American strikes, same pattern both times. Now here's the part that actually raises the stakes for everyone watching this unfold. White House officials reportedly believed that seizing Kharg outright would bankrupt the Revolutionary Guard's revenue stream completely and could force a swift end to the entire war through pure economic collapse. On the other side, Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid said publicly that Israel should go further, that it should destroy every piece of Iran's oil infrastructure on that island to topple the regime for good. 2 very different appetites for how far this campaign should actually go, operating in the same theater at the same time. And Iran clearly wasn't treating any of this as empty talk, because there's reporting that Iran laid traps and moved additional military personnel and air defenses onto the island, specifically anticipating a ground operation. Iran's own parliament speaker warned back in March that enemies were preparing to occupy one of the country's islands, and while he never named it directly, nobody seriously thinks he meant anywhere else. Now let's get to what actually happened most recently, because I think this is the most misunderstood piece of the whole timeline. After Trump declared the ceasefire over, fresh strikes hit in response to Iranian attacks on tankers transiting the strait. Trump, speaking on the sidelines of the NATO summit, said he gave Iran a little warning and then hit them hard that night. Central Command reported more than 60 Revolutionary Guard boats struck in that single round, 28 of them knocked out in one night alone, according to Trump directly. And Kharg Island itself got hit again as part of that same operation. He floated, seizing the island outright again, something he's repeated basically every single time this topic resurfaces. And then, just as I was putting this story together, fresh reporting surfaced that the U.S. had disabled a commercial oil tanker, the Curaçao-flagged M/T Belma, allegedly trying to sail toward Kharg in defiance of the reimposed naval blockade. Central Command said the ship ignored multiple warnings, and a U.S. aircraft fired Hellfire missiles directly into its smokestack, disabling propulsion without sinking it or, as far as reported, causing crew casualties. Central Command's statement ended with one blunt line: the ship is no longer transiting to Iran. That's a new tactic in this specific war as far as anyone's reported it, choking the island's function through blockade enforcement on open water instead of direct strikes on the facility itself. So here's my honest fact check on that dramatic headline you clicked on, because I promised you at the top I wasn't going to oversell this. Kharg Island has not been erased. Not literally. Not yet. It's been struck at least twice directly, with a possible third hit this week, somewhere close to 140 combined military targets across those raids. And the oil infrastructure that actually generates 90% of Iran's export revenue has, by every account, including Iran's own state media, remained functionally intact after every single strike. What's actually escalated isn't the bombing of the terminal itself. It's the blockade enforcement around it, ships getting physically disabled before they even arrive. There's one more thread here that doesn't get nearly enough airtime, and it's the part that actually keeps me up at night thinking about it from a planning perspective. Reporting has surfaced that Marine Expeditionary Units, the kind built specifically for fast amphibious raids, have already been positioned in the region alongside roughly 1,000 soldiers from the Army's 82nd Airborne, postured for exactly the kind of ground seizure Trump keeps floating in public. A retired vice admiral who used to run deputy operations at Central Command told reporters Marines could probably take the island in a matter of hours, given how small and lightly garrisoned it actually is. Taking it, he said, is the easy part. And that's where it gets uncomfortable, because holding a small, exposed island under sustained drone and missile harassment is a completely different animal than the initial assault footage that dominates the news cycle. Iran has spent recent weeks visibly preparing for exactly this scenario, laying traps, moving in shoulder-fired missile systems, reinforcing air defenses that earlier strikes had already degraded but clearly not eliminated. One retired four-star, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, put it bluntly, saying he'd be genuinely worried about an operation like this because, in his words, the Iranians are clever and ruthless, and there's a chilling piece of intelligence underneath all of that. One source close to the planning raised the possibility that if American forces seized and held the island, Iran's most rational move wouldn't be trying to retake it. It would be striking the oil infrastructure itself, since at that point there'd be nothing left to lose. Add to that an unresolved satellite-detected slick near the island, roughly 45 kilometers of residue that outside researchers flagged as consistent with an oil spill, something Iranian officials attribute to a passing European tanker rather than military activity, and you see how many ways this could still go sideways, even with the current restraint holding. Now let me give you my own read on this, and I'll flag clearly that this next part is analysis, not reporting. I think the restraint on that oil terminal has been the single most consistent thread running through this entire sub-story, and I don't think it's squeamishness on anyone's part. I think it's a calculated leverage play. Destroy the terminal completely, and you burn your own biggest card, because once that damage is done, Iran has zero further incentive to comply with anything. Keeping it standing but constantly threatened is, from a pure coercive standpoint, worth more than actually pulling the trigger, at least as long as Iran keeps believing the threat is real. And that tanker disabling, I think that's actually a bigger strategic shift than another round of island strikes would be, because it signals a move from threatening the facility to strangling what reaches it, a slow economic squeeze that carries far less international blowback than flattening a terminal that handles 90% of a nation's exports. So where does this actually leave us today? Kharg Island has been struck by American forces at least twice, with a likely third hit this week, close to 140 military targets destroyed across those raids. The oil infrastructure remains standing and operational by every account on record, including Iran's own. Trump has floated seizing the island outright more times than I can count, and has never pulled that trigger. And this week, the tactic shifted toward choking ships headed for the island rather than striking the facility again directly. That's the accurate, sourced picture, and it's a lot more layered than a headline like ERASED would suggest, which is exactly why I wanted to slow down and walk you through the receipts instead of just running with the dramatic version everyone else is pushing right now. If this kind of fact-first breakdown is useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the moment that restraint actually breaks, I'll be the one bringing you the real version of that story too, not the exaggerated one.